Ask someone who lived through the jet age to name the aircraft that changed everything, and they'll almost always say the same thing: the Boeing 707. They'll describe the sound of those four engines, the speed, the feeling of the future arriving all at once. Almost nobody mentions the Douglas DC-8, and yet it was there, every step of the way, flying the same routes, carrying the same passengers, crossing the same oceans. For some airlines, it was the only jet they operated for years. Millions of people flew on it. Millions of people arrived safely because of it. Millions of people stepped off the jetway, collected their luggage, and went on with their lives without ever knowing or particularly caring what aircraft had just brought them home. The DC-8 didn't fail. It was never disgraced. It simply wasn't remembered. This is the story of why. To understand the DC-8's strange fate, you have to understand the world it was born into and the company that built it. Douglas Aircraft Company by the mid-1950s was not an underdog. It was arguably the most successful commercial aircraft manufacturer in the world. The DC-3 had almost single-handedly made commercial aviation economically viable in the 1930s. The DC-4, DC-6, and DC-7 had carried the post-war expansion of air travel on their wings. When airlines around the world thought about reliable, proven, commercially sensible aircraft, they thought about Douglas. The name carried a weight that Boeing at that point was still working to match in the commercial market. Boeing, by contrast, had built its post-war reputation primarily in the military sphere. The B-47 and B-52 strategic bombers had established Boeing's credentials in jet technology and swept-wing design. But the commercial market, the world of passenger carrying, of airline economics, of the particular demands that came with moving ordinary people from city to city, was Douglas territory. Had been for 20 years. So when the jet age began to announce itself in the early 1950s, Douglas sat in a position that was, in retrospect, as dangerous as it was comfortable. They were the established power, the proven quantity, the company that airlines trusted with their fleets and their finances. And precisely because of that established position, they moved carefully, deliberately, perhaps too deliberately. Boeing made a different calculation. In 1952, they committed to building a jet prototype, the aircraft that would eventually become the 707, largely at their own expense, before the airlines had committed to buying it. It was an enormous financial gamble. Boeing's leadership understood that if the jet age was coming, being second was not a commercially survivable position. They bet the company on being first. Douglas watched, studied, consulted with their airline customers, and the feedback they received was nuanced in a way that is easy to misread as hesitation. Airlines weren't refusing jets, they were asking specific questions. What would maintenance cost? How would the economics work on thinner routes? What were the true operating costs across a full network, not just the prestige transatlantic runs? Douglas took those questions seriously, perhaps more seriously than the moment allowed. By the time Douglas formally committed to the DC-8 and began taking orders, Boeing had a significant head start, not just in development, but in the far more important currency of airline relationships. Pan American, the most prestigious carrier in the world and the airline whose fleet choices set the direction for the entire industry, had ordered both the 707 and the DC-8. It was a hedge, a negotiating tactic, and a signal that Juan Thrip at Pan Am was playing both sides of the competition with characteristic shrewdness. But the 707 order came first, and in the jet age, first mattered in ways that were disproportionate to the technical differences between the two aircraft. The DC-8 entered service in 1959, roughly a year after the 707. 1 year. 12 months. In almost any other industry, that gap would have been commercially irrelevant. And the jet age, in that specific market, with those specific dynamics, it was the gap that defined everything that followed. What Douglas had built, however, was genuinely impressive. The DC-8 wasn't a reaction to the 707, it was an independent answer to the same question. How do you build a jet transport that airlines can operate profitably, that passengers will trust, and that can sustain decades of service? Douglas had been answering commercial aviation questions for longer than almost anyone. Their answer in the DC-8 reflected that experience in ways that pilots and mechanics would come to deeply appreciate, even if passengers never knew or cared. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The Douglas DC-8 and the Boeing 707 were, to a casual observer, nearly identical. Four underwing jet engines, swept wings, long pressurized fuselage, similar performance at altitude. Passengers sitting in window seats at 35,000 feet looking at clouds through oval windows would have been hard-pressed to tell the difference. But the aircraft were not the same, and the people who knew them best, the pilots, the mechanics, the flight engineers who spent their careers inside them, understood the differences in ways that were consequential. Start with the fuselage. The DC-8 was slightly narrower than the 707 in its original configuration, a detail that sounds trivial and was, for passengers, essentially invisible. But Douglas made a design decision that would prove remarkably farsighted. They engineered the DC-8's fuselage with a cross-section that could be stretched. The basic structure, from the beginning, was designed to accommodate a longer, higher-capacity variant without fundamental redesign. This wasn't obvious in 1959. It became obvious in the late 1960s when the stretched DC-8 Super 60 series emerged, and Douglas offered airlines an aircraft that could carry dramatically more passengers on the same basic airframe. The economics of that stretch were compelling in ways that gave the DC-8 a second commercial life, just as it might otherwise have aged out of the market. The wing was another area where Douglas made choices that reflected their commercial philosophy. The DC-8's wing was designed with somewhat more conservative sweep than the 707's, which gave it slightly different low-speed handling characteristics. Pilots transitioning to the DC-8 from propeller backgrounds, the same men who found the 707 demanding, generally found the DC-8's handling qualities slightly more accessible. Not dramatically different, but marginally more forgiving in certain configurations. This wasn't accidental. Douglas had listened to the airline's concerns about training and transition costs, and they had tried to build those concerns into the aircraft's fundamental behavior. The cockpit reflected Douglas's history of working closely with airline operations. The instrument layout was arranged with a logic that operators found sensible and maintainable, not radically different from the 707, but with small choices, small placements, small ergonomic decisions that experienced flight engineers and first officers noticed and appreciated. There is a quality in cockpit design that is difficult to quantify but unmistakable to the people who spend their working lives in one, a quality of having been designed by people who thought carefully about the humans who would operate the systems, not just about the systems themselves. Douglas had been doing this for 20 years. It showed. The engines on early DC-8s were, like the 707's, drawn from Pratt & Whitney's JT3 family, a practical inevitability given the state of the industry at the time. But Douglas was an early and enthusiastic adopter of the improved turbofan variants, and the DC-8 with later engine fits became an aircraft that operators found genuinely economical. Fuel burn mattered enormously to airline economics, and the DC-8's engine evolution was managed in a way that kept the aircraft competitive through multiple generations of power plant technology. Structurally, the DC-8 was built to last. Douglas's engineering culture had always emphasized longevity. The DC-33 had been designed in the 1930s and was still flying freight in remote corners of the world well into the 21st century. That philosophy showed in the DC-8. Mechanics who worked on the aircraft describe a structure that was honest and accessible, panels that came off without drama, systems that were laid out with maintenance access in mind, a basic architecture that rewarded familiarity with genuine understanding rather than confronting experienced hands with unnecessary complexity. The DC-8 was not a simple aircraft. No jet of its era was simple, but within the complexity of what it was, Douglas had tried to make the maintenance relationship sustainable. And the DC-8 could go fast, genuinely, notably fast, faster in certain circumstances than the 707. A DC-8 test aircraft became the first commercial jetliner to exceed the speed of sound in a controlled dive in 1961, reaching Mach 1.012 before the pilots eased back. This wasn't operational, no airline was scheduling supersonic DC-8 service, but it said something real about the structural integrity and aerodynamic design of the aircraft. Douglas had built something with genuine margin, something that could be asked hard questions and answer them. None of this made newspaper front pages the way the 707's introduction did. None of it generated the cultural moment that Pan American's first transatlantic jet service created. The DC-8's virtues were the kind that revealed themselves over time, in maintenance logs and operating cost reports, and the quiet professional appreciation of people who worked with the aircraft every day. They were real virtues. They were just the wrong shape for the story the public was watching. The people who flew the DC-8, maintained it, and served passengers aboard it share a quality in how they talk about it that is distinctive and, once you notice it, hard to shake. They are quietly, persistently fond of the aircraft in a way that has nothing to do with nostalgia for the era and everything to do with the machine itself. Pilots who flew the DC-8 as their primary type, who spent years, sometimes entire careers in its cockpit, describe it in terms that are almost uniformly affectionate. Not the reverent affection that attaches to legendary aircraft, something warmer and more personal than that. The affection you have for a colleague who always showed up, always did the work, never created unnecessary drama. One captain who flew DC-8s for United Airlines for nearly 15 years described the aircraft this way. It was honest with you. It told you what it was going to do before it did it, and if you listened, it never surprised you badly. That quality of honesty, of legibility, of being an aircraft that communicated with its crew rather than confronting them, was something pilots appreciated the more experience they accumulated. The early jet transition period, with its demands and its humbling of veteran aviators, produced a generation of pilots who had a particular appreciation for aircraft that didn't add unnecessary difficulty to an already demanding job. The DC-8, in their assessment, didn't add difficulty. It was demanding in the ways that all jets of the era were demanding, but within those demands, it was fair. The flight engineers, the third crew member who managed the DC-8 systems from a station behind the pilots, developed a relationship with the aircraft that was, in some ways, the most intimate of all. The DC-8 systems were complex and required active management, but they were organized with a clarity that experienced flight engineers found, over time, genuinely satisfying. One veteran flight engineer who spent 20 years on the type described knowing the DC-8 system so thoroughly that he could diagnose anomalies by sound and feel before any instrument confirmed what was wrong. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a simple aircraft. It comes from an aircraft complex enough to reward complete understanding, and the DC-8 rewarded it. The cabin crews who worked the DC-8 had their own experience of the aircraft, shaped by the particular rhythms of the routes it flew. The DC-8 was a workhorse, not in a pejorative sense, but in the sense that airlines put it to work on routes that mattered, with the confidence that comes from trust. United flew it across the continental United States. Delta flew it to Europe. Japan Airlines, Italia, Air Canada. Carriers around the world found in the DC-8 an aircraft they could build schedules around. The stewardesses and pursers who worked those routes developed a working familiarity with the aircraft's interior that translated into a particular kind of professional confidence. They knew where things were. They knew how the aircraft behaved in turbulence. They knew the sounds it made during descent and what those sounds meant. That knowledge made them better at their jobs in ways that passengers benefited from without knowing. And the passengers themselves, what did they experience? Here is where the DC-8 story takes its particular ironic turn. What passengers experienced, overwhelmingly, was nothing remarkable. They boarded. They were seated. The engine started and the aircraft taxied, and the acceleration of takeoff pressed them back, and the ground fell away, and several hours later, they arrived. The aircraft performed exactly as promised, exactly as expected. And that performance, so consistent and so reliable, produced the most commercially devastating outcome possible. Passengers remembered their destinations, not their aircraft. There is a particular kind of failure in being too competent. The DC-8 was almost never the most dramatic thing about any journey it made. It was the vehicle, the means, and in the hierarchy of things passengers remembered from their travels, the hotel, the meeting, the family they were visiting, the city they were seeing for the first time, an aircraft that did its job perfectly and quietly occupied no memorable space at all. The mechanics who maintained the DC-8 at line stations around the world remember it differently, in the way that people who work closely with machines always have a more textured relationship with them than the people they carry. There is a consistent thread in mechanic accounts of the DC-8. The aircraft aged well. Problems that emerged were generally problems that maintenance could address rather than problems that ambushed experienced hands. The structure held up. The systems, understood, were manageable. Carriers that operated the DC-8 for decades found that their maintenance crews developed expertise that accumulated cleanly, knowledge that built on itself rather than being repeatedly scrambled by unexpected failure modes. The DC-8's commercial conflict was not a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, structural erosion that played out over 2 decades and was shaped by forces that had very little to do with the aircraft's quality. The Boeing 707's head start translated into market share that proved remarkably durable. Airlines that had ordered 707s built their training programs around them, their maintenance capabilities around them, their spare part inventories around them. Switching to DC-8s meant rebuilding those investments from scratch, a cost that was always present in the background of fleet decisions, regardless of what the DC-8's operating economics suggested. Network effects, as in technology, are powerful and persistent. Boeing also proved more aggressively responsive to airline feedback than Douglas during the critical early years. The 707 was stretched, modified, re-engined, and adapted in ways that kept it relevant across a wider range of airline networks. Douglas did the same with the DC-8. The Super Stretch series was genuinely successful, but by the time those variants entered service, the market had already assigned its loyalties. Then came the 747. Boeing's decision to build the 747, an aircraft so much larger than anything that had come before it that it effectively created a new category of air travel, restructured the competitive landscape in ways that marginalized both the 707 and the DC-8. Douglas responded with the DC-10, which was a capable wide-body aircraft, but one whose early history was marked by a series of accidents that did serious damage to the Douglas brand at a critical moment. The DC-10 safety record improved significantly over time, and the aircraft served for decades, but the reputational damage of those early years was real and lasting. Douglas Aircraft, by the late 1960s, was also dealing with financial pressures that had nothing to do with aircraft quality. Production overruns, contract difficulties, and the enormous capital demands of keeping pace with Boeing's wide-body development had stressed the company's balance sheet severely. In 1967, Douglas merged with McDonnell, becoming McDonnell Douglas, a marriage of necessity that preserved the company but changed its culture in ways that some who lived through it still find difficult to describe cleanly. The Douglas name survived. The Douglas identity, the Long Beach commercial aviation culture that had produced the DC-3 through the DC-8, was gradually transformed into something different. The DC-8's final chapter in passenger service came in the 1980s, as quieter, more fuel-efficient wide-bodies made the older narrow-bodies increasingly expensive to operate on passenger routes. But the aircraft didn't end there. It found a second life, and for some operators, a third as a freighter. Re-engined with modern high-bypass turbofan engines, the DC-8 freighter became, paradoxically, a modern aircraft in a vintage airframe, capable of meeting noise regulations and fuel economics that had retired passenger-configured examples. DC-8 freighters were still operating into the 2010s, carrying cargo with the same quiet reliability that had carried passengers across 3 decades of airline history. The DC-8's legacy is not the kind that fills museum wings or anchors documentary series. It is the legacy of a standard that was set and maintained, a demonstration that the principles Douglas had applied to commercial aviation since the 1930s translated successfully into the jet age, even if the jet age ultimately belonged to someone else. The stretched DC-8, the Series 61, 62, and 63, remained in service long enough to become a genuine bridge between the first generation of commercial jets and the era of wide-body aircraft. Airlines that operated them found that the economics, particularly on routes where the massive capacity of the 707 was more than the market required, remained competitive well into the 1970s. The DC-8-63, the longest and most capable of the stretch series, carried more passengers than any other single-aisle jet of its era, and did so with an efficiency that justified Douglas's original design philosophy. For the pilots and mechanics who spent careers on the aircraft, the DC-8's legacy is personal and specific. It is the aircraft that didn't let them down, the one that showed up every day, that rewarded their expertise with honest feedback, that aged with a dignity that is not common in aviation. Several veteran pilots have described the DC-8 as the aircraft they'd have chosen to fly if market forces hadn't eventually moved them elsewhere, a statement that means more coming from professionals than it might from enthusiasts. The aircraft also demonstrated something important about the relationship between engineering quality and commercial success, specifically that they are related but not identical. The DC-8 was as good as the 707 in most of the ways that mattered to the people who actually operated and flew it. In some ways, it was better. But commercial aviation history belongs to the 707, and the DC-8 belongs to the category of excellent things that happened quietly while history was looking the other way. We began with the question, how does an aircraft that carried millions of passengers safely across oceans and continents for decades simply fade from memory? The answer, I think, is both simple and quietly sad. The DC-8 was forgotten because it was reliable, because it did exactly what it was designed to do, every time, without drama and without exception, because the people who flew on it arrived at their destinations thinking about where they were going, not about how they got there, because competence at the highest level is often invisible. There is a particular kind of contribution that only becomes visible when you look for the absence of catastrophe, when you count the flights that landed safely, the passengers who arrived home, the crossings that were made without incident across 50 years of service. The DC-8 is full of that kind of contribution, millions of data points of nothing going wrong. We don't build monuments to nothing going wrong. We build them to the dramatic, the historic, the first. The DC-8 was none of those things, even when it was just as good as the aircraft that were. But somewhere in the world tonight, in some quiet corner of a freight network, there may still be a DC-8 airframe, re-engined, recertified, carrying cargo through the dark, doing exactly what it was always designed to do, reliably, quietly, without anyone particularly noticing, which is, in the end, exactly the DC-8's story. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.